A brass compass turns up in my palm like it's breathing wet grit packed around the hinge river stones set in a neat low circle at my boots. Above us, the cliff face sweats with mist, and the forest is so quiet you can hear the leather strap creak when I ease it free. Later, much later, I will hold that same compass under a strip of hospital light, while a thin man by the window clicks softly to himself, eyes fixed on the dark line of trees beyond the glass. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and hit like and subscribe if you believe some names should never fade. I live on the bend where Kalawaway narrows just past the alder cut in a house that carries rain the way an old coat carries campfire smoke. In 2017, I was newly retired from the Park Service and volunteering with County Search and Rescue, still waking before dawn out of habit. Mornings had their shape: a kettle on the stove, steam fogging the kitchen window, the police scanner low on the counter, and the slow gray lift of fog over the spruces out back. My hands were always busy oiling an old Pulaski, swapping out wiper blades on the pickup, laying out rope to dry on the porch rail. My days were simple, measured in coffee cups and weather fronts, and I liked it that way. The town moved to its own metronome. Delivery semis groaned through before breakfast, and the diner on Bogachiel opened with the same flare of neon and the same clatter of the screen door. The kids on bikes traced the same loops from the schoolyard to the ball fields. When the sun did show up, it touched the logging trucks first, chrome flashing like river water. Peace here wasn't loud. It was knowing you could hear your neighbor's latch click 2 houses down and know they were out to check their tomatoes. It was the dependable rhythm of rain, soft in the afternoon, hard after dark, washing the smell of cedar and damp soil through every open window. Luke came by the house the way old friends do, no text, just a quick knock and a shadow in the storm door. We'd met on a trail crew years back and stayed in touch through moves and deployments and job changes. He had a habit of checking a room like it was a map, patient, efficient, never missing corners. That day in June, he set his elbows on my table and spread a paper topo like a priest opening a prayer book. The lines on it were tight as cordage, the ridge lines stacked like the pleats of a folded fan. "We're headed in light," he said, running a finger along a contour that disappeared into pale green. 40 miles all told out and back. 7 days if the brush isn't too nasty. 2 days to the low basin, 3 through 2 to climb out. We check in every other evening. I want your eyes on this Dan. Anything we're missing? He wasn't a man who missed much. He'd gathered a team the way a builder picks lumber, straight-grained, solid, no hidden knots. Claire had hands that never shook even when they should. I'd seen her thread an IV in the back of a moving rig, humming under her breath. Brian thought in circuits and satellites, laying out gadgets on a table like he was dealing cards, GPS units, a satellite phone, backup batteries, a little weatherproof case for SD cards. Megan carried history in her head like a compass she trusted, excited about a sliver of rumor, an old chapel or wayside shrine tucked away where logging plans and old maps didn't quite agree. And Evan, the youngest, saw the world in frames and pacing his camera always near, but his attention always human. He asked more about the people who cut the old cedar than the cedar itself. I remember the first time all 5 of them came by together. The front of my place smelled like coffee and wet fir needles, porch boards print-stamped with boot soles. Luke asked permission out of habit. We good to spread out, and Megan had already drifted to my bookshelf, thumbing a dog-eared guide to trails that don't exist anymore. Evan took in the room, not the objects, the dent in the chair rail where my father's pack frame had knocked it every fall, the stack of laminated maps wrapped with a rubber band gone flat. Claire handed me a zippered pouch before I could offer tourniquet's gauze, a small miracle of sterilized order. "Sanity in a bag," she said, smiling with her eyes the way people in emergency work learn to do. Brian powered up the sat phone on my porch, the device giving a little electronic chirp that made the neighbor's lab prick both ears. He stepped into the yard, held it high, and waited for the signal bars to settle. 2 spares, he said, patting the case. 3 if you count the borrowed one in my pack. 2 GPS units, both with fresh maps. Batteries enough to run a radio station. We'll check in every 48 hours, same time. If we miss once, assume weather or canopy. Twice, call me an idiot. 3rd time, worry. Take more paracord than you think, I told them, tapping the topo with a fingernail. Brush is bad where it pools in the swales. It eats cordage. And bring the cheap emergency blankets. If you lose the big tarp, you'll still have something to throw up fast. Watch your feet in the low country hidden water holes where the skunk cabbage does a good job lying to you. If you hear water where the map says it goes underground, trust your ears. They listened the way people do before a long drive, respectful but eager to get on the road. The June light had a thin yellow to it that afternoon, touching the rim of Luke's brass compass where it hung from his belt, no-nonsense, old school, the kind of thing you keep because it never fails you. When he noticed me noticing, he grinned, almost embarrassed. "Gift from my dad," he said, flipping it open. The needle snapped north and settled like it was glad to be asked. Our town held them for a few days, like a tide pool holds the sea just enough time to meet the waitress who always remembered orders to dig into blueberry pie and black coffee to buy one more roll of athletic tape at the hardware store. I watched them move as a unit without having to be told. Megan walked a half step off Luke's shoulder while she talked. Claire clocked exits the way medics do when they can't help it. Brian counted gear without counting out loud. Evan walked backward twice on the sidewalk to test the smoothness of his camera gimbal and didn't have to look to keep his balance. Peace doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just sits in the way. Bodies lean toward each other. They left before noon on a Thursday, the road steaming under them in a light rain. The plan was clean drive to the last spur where the gravel runs out, lock the SUV and go in on foot. Luke walked me through it twice for good measure. "We check in Saturday evening, 8 sharp, he said, spinning the compass lid with his thumb. Then Monday, then Wednesday. Same time, same window. If we're late by more than a few hours, assume canopy or weather not catastrophe. I wished them the plain practical things you wish fair weather. Steady footing, the good kind of tired at the end of the day. Tape your heels before they ask you to." I told Evan, who laughed and held up a roll in answer. Claire squeezed my forearm and said, "You still answer your phone after dark?" I told her yes, though in truth I slept light and kept my boots by the door. That first evening after they went in, the house felt a little larger than it had the night before. I rinsed my coffee mug and left it upside down to dry the way I always do and laid my old rain jacket over the chair to warm against the baseboard heater. When the 8 o'clock window came around, I turned the scanner a little lower and put the sat phone repeaters in my head like a metronome I didn't admit to needing. There's a sound the rain makes when it moves in for the night, a deeper softness like a blanket settling over a sleeping dog. I listened to that and thought about them finding their first dry shelf, shrugging their packs off the little satisfaction of a stove, blooming to life under a titanium pot. Saturday's check-in came right on time. Brian's voice light with the kind of fatigue that's a badge of honor. A few words, a quick joke about the brush, the bark of Luke's laugh somewhere off mic. I logged the time out of habit and slept like a man who has done his part, small though it was. Sunday was laundry and a drive out past Sappho to watch the river thin late sun on green water. Monday morning tasted like copper in the air, the way it does before the weather decides to turn, but the sky never quite made up its mind. I've always believed in routines because they anchor you when the unexpected tries to move through you like a wave. Monday afternoon, I fixed the porch light that had started to buzz in the damp. I wiped a thin line of rust from the lawn chair screws. I cut sections of old rope that had taken too much grit and made it into dog leashes for the shelter. There's comfort in work that fits your hands. It keeps you honest about what you can and can't control. By late day, the clouds were stacked low and clean, the kind that throw a better sunset than you think they will. I set a plate by the sink and told myself not to hover. then hovered anyway. 8 o'clock isn't a sacred hour, but it can feel like one when you've made a promise to meet it. I kept the scanner murmuring, and the living room lamp on low yellow light pooling on the old pine floor. Across the street, Mrs. Hanley clicked off her television and turned her porch light on like she always does a little lighthouse for no one in particular. A little before 8, I took Luke's topo from the sideboard where I'd left it and traced the line he'd pointed to. The basin, the pitch up the far side, the narrow break in the ridge where wind lives year-round. My finger followed the tight lines like prayer beads. Outside, a truck gear braked on the highway, and the sound moved through the trees and thinned out gentle as breath at the end of a sentence. At 8 exactly, I sat down at the table with my notebook open to a fresh page. The house ticked those tiny settling sounds old places make when they remember they were built of living things. Rain kept a steady hand on the roof. Somewhere deeper in the neighborhood, a screen door thumped, and a dog shook its collar. I eased the volume up a notch and waited for Brian's matter-of-fact voice for Luke's quick aside for the soft buzz of life reaching out from the green distance. The minute hand moved. The rain didn't change. I set my pencil down to stop myself tapping. At 5, after I told myself what I'd told them, canopy eats signal weather bends, sound, patience is part of the job. At 10, after I stood and walked to the window, and the porch light threw a soft cone across the wet boards, catching the rim of my old coil of rope like a thin silver ring. Across the street, Mrs. Hanley's light burned steady as the tide. 15 minutes in, I poured coffee I didn't want and watched steam ghost up and vanish. The clock on the stove clicked over to the next mark. Outside, the cedar boughs swung once in a breeze that didn't last. Somewhere far off, a horn not angry, just the ordinary kind, rose and fell and was gone. I set my mug down on the coaster by the phone and rested my hand there lightly so the heat wouldn't leave a mark. 9 o'clock, the house breathing with me. The rain carrying on the line, still quiet. I crossed the room and turned the porch light up a notch brighter than it needed to be for a night where no one was expected. Then I sat back down and left my hand over the old brass compass that wasn't mine, a weight I didn't know I had chosen, and listened to the quiet run past the hour like a stream slipping its bank. By the time the porch light finally burned itself out that night, I'd stopped pretending the delay was just weather. Still, I didn't call anyone. You tell yourself you've seen enough searches, enough false alarms to know when to wait. I kept the map open on the table, my finger resting where the contour lines tighten into that deep green basin. I must have sat there an hour, listening to the rain ride the roof until it slipped into a steady hiss. When I did finally crawl into bed, I left the phone on the nightstand, its little red light blinking like a heart that didn't know it had stopped. The next morning came dull and silver. No birds, just the patter of water dropping from the trees. I called Luke's number first, then Brian's. Both went straight to voicemail. I left short messages, steady voice, no panic. Told them to hit me back when they reached higher ground. I even drove into town and checked with the ranger station, though I knew how it would go. The young guy at the desk looked up from his screen and said exactly what I'd once said to worried families. It's probably just a signal gap. Happens all the time. I wanted to believe him. God, I did. But by Monday evening, when there was still nothing, that familiar itch, the one every search and rescue man learns to read, started in the base of my throat. Something wasn't right. I called our SAR coordinator, a woman named Linda Perez, who'd worked the peninsula longer than most of us had been alive. She said she'd make a few calls, see if the local authorities had picked up any chatter from hikers or pilots. I told her I'd drive down if they needed an extra pair of boots. She told me to hang tight, that we weren't there yet. Tuesday was when the silence started to feel heavy, like a sound you couldn't hear but could still feel pressing on your chest. The Carter family called first, then Claire's brother from Idaho. I could hear the strain in their voices, the forced calm of people trying not to think about what they already know. I told them what I always tell people in those moments, that weather delays happen, that batteries die, that good teams take their time when the brush gets thick. But I didn't tell them I'd already checked the storm data. The skies had been clear. No reason for a missed transmission. By Thursday, the county had opened an incident report, and by Saturday, a formal search was underway. I drove out before sunrise to meet them at the logging road where Luke had planned to leave their SUV. The air was cool enough to see your breath, the ground soaked and black from a week of drizzle. The SUV was still there, locked clean, parked exactly where he'd said it would be. No broken glass, no footprints worth reading, just the scent of wet cedar and something faintly metallic, like rusted tools after rain. A handful of us locals, deputies and volunteers, stood in a loose circle while the sheriff briefed the team. His voice had that careful tone of authority trying to hold back uncertainty. I knew it well. "We'll grid from the East Ridge down," he said, pointing to a map spread over the hood of a truck. "Helicopter team will scan the canopy for any sign of campfire smoke or movement. They had a sat phone, but so far no ping. Someone asked if it could have been stolen. He said it wasn't likely. Too deep in to be worth the trouble. When we started into the brush, it swallowed us fast. Even with machetes clearing the way, it was like walking through green steel wool. The air was thick enough to drink. Every step sank into soft earth. The smell of moss and decay filled your lungs until it felt like you were breathing the forest itself. I'd done this hundreds of times, but something about this stretch felt different too. Quiet. No insects, no frogs, no movement except what we made. After an hour, sweat ran down my back despite the cool air, and the only sound was the rasp of machetes and the wet thud of boots on soil. That day ended with nothing. Just trees, vines, and the same blank silence. But the next morning, one of the aerial teams spotted a patch of open ground about 12 miles and too regular to be natural. We hiked there on foot, 6 of us, and by mid-afternoon, we found it. The camp. At first glance, it looked like any field setup tent standing fire pit cold but intact. A couple of metal bowls scattered near the logs, an empty mug half buried in the dirt. It took a second to realize what made the air feel wrong. There was no chaos. No torn fabric, no scattered supplies. Everything looked paused. Sleeping bags, unzipped boots placed neatly by the entrances, but no people. I crouched near the fire ring and touched the ashes. Cold. Not soaked through, just cold, meaning it had been out long before the last rain. Claire's med kit sat on a tarp still zipped, but lighter than it should have been. Brian's drone case lay open empty. Their packs were gone. So was their food, their weapons, their electronics. Whatever happened, they left with intention, or someone took them with purpose. We marked coordinates, photographed everything, and radioed the sheriff. The rest of the day, we combed 100 yards in every direction. No tracks, no blood, no drag marks. Just the faint scent of something human that had long since moved on. By the time we hiked back to base, the light was going and the choppers had already returned to refuel. I remember looking up through the canopy as the blades thumped away and the forest closed back over the sound like it had never been there. That night, sitting around the folding table at base camp, I watched the younger deputies argue theories like they were trading baseball cards. Lost, turned around. Maybe an accident. Maybe a run-in with poachers. Theories are easy when the forest is a line on a map and not breathing down your neck. Linda caught my eye and shook her head. "Too clean," she said quietly. "You've seen it. Nobody leaves a camp like that unless they're planning to come back." And they didn't. The search expanded dogs, drones, locals on ATVs. We covered nearly 20 square miles. Every day blurred into the next wake-up and fog hike till your legs buzz mark coordinates come back with nothing. It wears you down, the not knowing. The sound of your own breathing becomes company. The smell of wet nylon, the constant hum of mosquitoes. Days passed, and the only trace we found was a strip of nylon snagged on a thorn, bright blue like a sliver of sky against all that green. I kept it pressed flat inside my field notebook as if proof could hold off grief. After 3 weeks, the sheriff's office called off active search. The official report used the words presumed lost. Families were notified, memorials planned. I stood beside Luke's parents at the small service they held in town, just a few of us in folding chairs, a framed photo on the table, the smell of rain creeping in through the open doors. His mother touched the compass hanging from her neck, the one he'd given her years before, and whispered that she hoped he'd found peace. I didn't know what to tell her. Peace isn't something you find out there. It's something the forest takes when it wants it. Months passed, then years. The gear we used that summer got repurposed for other searches, other names. I stopped carrying the topo maps in my truck, though sometimes I caught myself tracing the same invisible route on my steering wheel at stoplights. 6 years is a long time to keep a silence alive. Eventually, even the families stopped calling. The case file was moved to archives, the paper faded at the edges. I tried not to think about it, but the mind has its own compass. It always drifts back to unfinished business. Then, one humid July afternoon in 2023, my phone rang. It was Linda. Her voice had that strange calm you hear in dispatchers before they deliver news. "You better sit down," she said. "They found him." I didn't understand at first found who, but she didn't have to say the name. Somehow I already knew. They'd picked him up outside Tacoma, walking barefoot along the shoulder of a highway. He was alive, skin and bone hair, matted scars up and down his arms. Wouldn't or couldn't speak. When they ran his DNA, it matched Evan, the same Evan who'd walked into the forest 6 years ago with a camera and a grin and a plan. The news hit like cold water. Relief, confusion, dread, it all came tangled. I drove out to the hospital that evening, though I wasn't family, just an old ranger who'd known them before the silence began. The nurse led me down a narrow corridor that smelled of antiseptic and stale air. Through the glass, I saw him sitting by the window, his face hollowed by time, eyes fixed on the line of trees outside. He didn't move when I stepped in, didn't blink when I said his name. He just sat there, hands on his knees, rocking slightly, making a soft clicking sound in the back of his throat. I tried to tell him who I was, how I'd been there when they left, how we'd searched. My voice cracked halfway through. He didn't flinch. The doctor explained the medical terms, dissociative amnesia, trauma-induced mutism, but none of it made sense. You can't name something that's beyond words. I asked if he remembered the others. The doctor said they'd tried that too. Showed him photos, maps, his old camera. Nothing. He looked at everything like it belonged to another life. When I left the hospital that night, I stood in the parking lot a long while, the hum of the sodium lights overhead, the smell of warm asphalt rising through the air. Somewhere out past the tree line, an owl called 3 slow notes. For a heartbeat, I swear I saw something stir behind his window, the faint tilt of his head, like he'd heard it too. That was the beginning of the new search, not for bodies this time, but for answers. The questions that kept us up weren't about the forest anymore. They were about what could carve 6 years out of a man's life and leave him breathing but gone. I thought the jungle had taken everything it wanted from us back in 2017. Turns out it had just been waiting to return one of its own. And that's where the second chapter of this story begins, not with discovery, but with return. A man stepped out of silence and back into our world, carrying the shape of something terrible we couldn't yet see. I didn't know it then, but his eyes, blank unfocused, were already pointing us toward a place that still hadn't let go of the others. The first time I watched Evan draw, I didn't understand what I was seeing. He sat cross-legged in the corner of his hospital room, back pressed against the wall, a small piece of charcoal gripped tight between his fingers. There was a tremor in his hand, but his eyes were steady, fixed somewhere far beyond the paper in front of him. He wasn't drawing people or faces or anything recognizable at first. Just lines, circles, jagged shapes that seemed to collapse into each other. The doctor said it was a sign of returning motor function, maybe the start of memory surfacing. But to me it looked like a man trying to speak through a language that had no words left in it. They'd brought me in as a consultant by then, partly because of my past work in search and rescue, partly because I'd known him before everything went wrong. I'd been around long enough to know that sometimes survivors don't come back whole, that they carry pieces of another world inside them, one you'll never fully see. But even knowing that didn't prepare me for the weight that hung in that room. The blinds were half drawn, the fluorescent light humming like it was trying not to be heard. You could smell antiseptic and the faint trace of sweat from someone who hadn't yet relearned what comfort felt like. The staff spoke softly around him, like noise itself might crack the thin layer of calm that kept him tethered here. A young psychologist, Dr. Harmon, showed me some of his behavioral notes. Evan didn't speak or respond to questions, but he reacted to certain sounds. Rain calmed him. The whir of the air conditioner didn't. Bird calls, recorded ones, made him visibly tense, especially one sound, she said. Some kind of tropical bird that to him seemed unbearable. They'd played the clip once, and he'd curled in on himself like a child hiding from thunder. The doctor said he'd been surviving on roots fruit, maybe small animals. His digestive system was still adapting to normal food. His skin carried old scars, some rope burns, some blunt marks like he'd been struck with something flexible but heavy. The most haunting part wasn't his body, though it was his silence. You could sit there for an hour and feel it creeping under your own skin, that kind of emptiness that doesn't belong in the living. When he finally started making those drawings again, the psychologists brought me in to interpret them. It wasn't long before a pattern began to take shape. What at first looked like chaos slowly started resolving into a landscape. There was a river that split in two, a mountain with a broken peak, a cluster of dots trees maybe or boulders, and always dead center, a single cross. He drew it over and over again on napkins, on paper, even once on the wall with the heel of his hand when they'd taken the charcoal away. I stayed late one night after the nurses had dimmed the hall lights. The hospital felt hollow that late, just the echo of carts rolling somewhere down the corridor and the faint beep of heart monitors. I laid the drawings out on a table and studied them under the lamp. My mind went back to the map Luke had shown me 6 years earlier. The one with that deep valley where the lines on the topo map folded into one another so tight they almost disappeared. I took a photo of Evan's sketch and later that week brought it to a friend at the Forest Service. Matching that hand-drawn scrawl to a real landscape took weeks. Analysts overlaid it onto satellite images checking river forks and ridgelines across a wide stretch of backcountry. Then one morning a tech called me into the office. "Look here," he said, pointing at the screen. "See that split in the river? And that notch in the mountain? It's a perfect match." The area he was pointing to was one we'd marked as impassable during the original search. A deep valley boxed in by cliffs, no trails in or out, except a narrow crack in the rock that could have been missed if you weren't standing right on it. It was in every sense a place meant to stay hidden. The next few weeks felt like the start of something I couldn't name. Authorities were cautious. No one wanted to say the word discovery yet. But the evidence kept piling up. Environmental samples taken from Evan's hair and clothes contained spores from plants that only grew at certain elevations, plants found in that same valley. Then came the sound study. A linguist analyzed recordings of the clicking noises Evan made at night. There was rhythm to it, repetition, almost syntax. The structure was too deliberate to be random. I'll never forget the day they played him the field recordings. It was in a controlled setting. White walls, a camera running in the corner. At first they played harmless sounds whined through leaves flowing water. He stayed calm, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the glass. Then they played the bird call, the one from that region. The sound was sharp, echoing through the speaker like a whistle cutting through still air. Evan froze. His breath came in short bursts. Then his body folded in half, his hands clutching his head, and he started to rock forward and back, clicking so fast it no longer sounded human. They stopped the tape, but it took several minutes before his body loosened again. When he finally looked up, tears were running down his face, but his expression didn't change. It was the closest thing to emotion I'd seen from him. That reaction told us everything we needed to know. Whatever had happened out there, that valley held the answers. Plans began for a new expedition, this time under law enforcement supervision. The team would be smaller but better equipped special forces, a forensic pathologist, a doctor, and one local guide who knew the region's tribal boundaries. I was asked to join in an advisory capacity. They wanted me close, someone who understood both terrain and trauma. Meanwhile, they kept Evan under observation. The idea was to bring him to a nearby base camp during the search, hoping proximity might trigger recognition. The doctors agreed, though, with reservations. They said his mind was fragile, that pushing too fast could cause permanent regression. I remember the morning they told him. The nurse laid a topographical map on the table, tracing her finger along the ridgeline to show where the team would go. For the first time, he reacted to an image. His breathing picked up. He leaned back in his chair, eyes locked on the paper like it had come alive. Then, in one fluid motion, he shoved the table forward and slammed his head against the wall. Once, twice. The sound was dull but final. It took 2 orderlies to restrain him. I can still hear the clicking sounds he made, then soft, desperate, the sound of memory trying to claw its way out of a locked room. After that, they sedated him. When I visited later, he was calmer but vacant again, like the episode had burned something out of him. His pulse steady, his body still. I stood by the bed, listening to the machines breathe for him. It struck me then that maybe memory isn't always mercy. Sometimes forgetting is what keeps a person alive. When the expedition finally launched, the air at the base camp felt heavy with that knowledge. The morning was clear but windless, the forest holding its breath. The helicopters dropped us near the foothills, too steep for landing deeper in. From there, it was all footwork packs, strapped tight boots sinking into mud as the trail disappeared into the green. Every sound mattered out there. The whine of insects, the trickle of unseen water, the creak of branches shifting under their own weight. Even the soldiers, trained to move in silence, seemed subdued by the scale of it. The jungle wasn't hostile. It was indifferent. That first night camped by a bend in the river, I took out the old map and ran my finger over the route we'd taken 6 years ago. The fire burned low shadows moving across the nylon of the tents. Somewhere in the dark, a frog called, then stopped mid-croak, like something had answered it. I lay awake a long time, thinking about Evan sitting by that window staring at a world he no longer recognized. By the 3rd day, the terrain began to change. The air grew thinner. The light dimmer filtered through higher canopy. We started seeing signs, small carvings in trees, rough cuts that didn't look like animal marks. Primitive traps made of vines and sharpened bamboo. Someone had lived here or still did. The guide's unease grew with each mile. He kept glancing at the cliffs ahead, muttering under his breath in a language I didn't know. When I asked, he just said old stories. This place not for people. It wasn't superstition that unsettled me, it was the silence that followed us wherever we went. Birds fell quiet when we entered certain clearings. The wind stopped moving at the same time we did, as if the forest itself were listening. On the morning we reached the narrow pass that marked the entrance to the valley, the world seemed to exhale all at once. The heat eased, the air thickened, still and gray. Beyond that point, nothing sounded right, not even our own footsteps. Standing there looking into that shaded bowl of land where the map's lines vanished, I felt the same chill I'd felt 6 years earlier when the search was called off. Back then I thought the forest had taken them and sealed its mouth. Now it felt like it had simply been waiting for someone to come back and ask the wrong question. The commander gave the signal to move forward. I adjusted my pack and followed. The first few steps into the valley felt heavier than they should have, like the air itself didn't want us. I glanced up toward the cliffs, the same ones I'd seen only as contour lines years before. In that dim light, their shapes looked less like rock and more like faces weathered hollow and watching. Somewhere behind me, the guide whispered something I couldn't make out, but I didn't need to ask. I already knew. We were walking into a place that wasn't meant to be found, a place marked on a lost man's drawing by a single cross, and whatever waited beyond those trees would tell us what really happened to Luke, Claire, Brian, and Megan. We just didn't know yet what kind of truth we were walking toward. When we crossed through the narrow pass and stepped into that valley, it was like walking into another world. The air itself seemed thicker, the temperature dropping just enough to raise gooseflesh along my arms. Behind us, the sound of the jungle fell away muffled until it felt like we'd sealed ourselves off from the rest of the planet. Even the insects were quiet. All that remained was the slow hum of our own breathing and the shuffle of boots against damp ground. The cliffs that framed the valley rose high and steep pale rock streaked with moss and the shadows of vines. You could tell no sunlight reached the floor here for long. It was a place that lived mostly in shade. The local guide who'd come with us stopped just inside the entrance. His face, already lined and weathered, went completely still. He wouldn't move another step. He muttered something under his breath and gestured for the rest of us to go on without him. The commander gave him a nod, maybe out of respect, maybe out of fear of what would happen if he forced it. I don't blame the man. The valley had a stillness that didn't feel natural, the kind of quiet you associate with old churches or graveyards where you instinctively lower your voice even when you're alone. We followed the river first, moving slow rifles down, but ready. The water was dark, sluggish, carrying a thin layer of algae that shimmered like oil. Every so often we'd find marks carved into the tree trunks along the bank, small grooves 3 or 4 in a vertical line. The ethnologist said they weren't tribal, at least not from any culture she knew. They looked deliberate, though, like trail markers or warnings. We found the first trap not long after that, a pit covered with branches and leaves, sharpened stakes rising from the bottom. It was old but functional, built with a kind of crude precision. No doubt left us all tightening our grips on our gear. Someone had lived here. By midday we reached a clearing. The light came through in long, dusty beams, and for the first time we could see open sky. In the center stood a group of structures, 5 or 6 huts made from branches and clay roofs sagging under years of rain. At a glance you could tell no one had lived there in a long time, yet the air smelled faintly of smoke, as if a fire had burned here not too many seasons ago. The commander gave a low signal, and we spread out, each of us taking a different hut. The first one I entered was small, low-ceilinged, and half-collapsed. My flashlight caught on a bit of blue fabric jammed into the wall, a strip of nylon faded but unmistakable. I ran my thumb along the edge of it and saw the stitched seam where it had once been part of a backpack. One of theirs. Across the clearing, a young soldier called out. He'd found a plastic container lid leaning against a wall, scratched and worn, but stamped with a logo I recognized from the food kits we'd issued to the team before they'd left 6 years earlier. That tiny, ordinary object hit harder than I expected. I found myself staring at it too long, feeling a kind of ache I hadn't let myself feel in years. You prepare yourself to find remains in this line of work, but it's the small human things, the spoon, the torn cloth, that make the truth sink in. They'd been here, lived here, maybe died here. We kept searching. There was no sign of bodies inside the huts, no bones, no clothing, nothing to suggest a fight. It was as though the place had been emptied carefully. When I stepped back outside, the commander was bent over the hand-drawn map we'd reconstructed from Evan's drawings. He pointed at the cross near the bottom, then toward a section of rock that rose at the edge of the clearing. It was maybe 100 yards away, half hidden by brush. We gathered our equipment and headed that way. As we got closer, the smell changed less green, more mineral, a faint coppery note underneath. We reached the base of the cliff, and that's when one of the men saw it, a ring of stones, neat and deliberate, 4 small mounds rising inside it. Not much taller than your knee, each outlined by river rock. Graves. The doctor dropped to one knee and began brushing the dirt back with gloved hands. The soil was loose, easy to move, and within minutes, pale bone showed through. She worked slowly, methodically, until a skull appeared, then another. I stood a few feet away, every nerve waiting for what we'd find next. There were personal items buried with them. A small brass compass, green with age, but still intact, the same one Luke always kept clipped to his belt. A silver crescent pendant tangled in the soil, Megan's a gift from her father. A metal spoon bent nearly in half, the initials BH scratched into the handle. And finally, a pair of surgical shears, dulled and rusted, still wrapped in a piece of weathered cloth. Claire. The air around those graves felt charged heavy. The men stayed quiet as the doctor whispered her observations. No bullet wounds, no fractures suggesting blunt trauma, but bone-thinning, clear evidence of starvation and disease. They hadn't been killed quickly. They'd been worn down, their bodies giving out piece by piece. We stood in silence for a long time before anyone moved. The commander gave the order to collect samples for analysis and mark the site for exhumation. It was then that the guide who had been lingering at the tree line after refusing to come farther shouted something to us and pointed toward the rock face. I followed his line of sight. About 10 feet up, faint scratches ran across the stone, parallel human-made stretching toward a cluster of vines that hung like a curtain. The pattern of them looked almost like tally marks. Someone had been keeping count. We pushed through the vines, and behind them a narrow crack opened into darkness. A cave. The air that came out was cool, damp, and smelled faintly of smoke and animal skin. The commander motioned for lights. When the beams cut through the dark, we saw a low space, maybe 20 feet deep. The floor was littered with bones, mostly animal, some small tools fashioned from stone and wood. On one wall, crude drawings, stick figures, spirals, handprints smeared in soot. In the far corner, a pile of dried leaves and furs pressed into the shape of a bed. And there, sitting in that corner, was a man. He didn't move when the light hit him. He was thin to the point of collapse, his hair gray, his beard long and matted his skin the color of parchment. He wore animal hides, stitched together with plant fiber. His eyes caught the light for a second, not with fear, but with the blank curiosity of someone seeing a shape, not a person. When the commander spoke to him in the local dialect, there was no response. Just a soft clicking sound from the man's throat, small, rhythmic, almost identical to the noises Evan had made back at the hospital. I remember the soldier next to me lowering his weapon and whispering, "My God." None of us needed to be told who this was. It wasn't one of our missing. It was the reason they never came home. We led him out of the cave slowly. He didn't resist, didn't flinch at the touch of hands on his arms. Outside, under the light, he looked even older, though it was hard to guess his age. The anthropologist said his features were local Cambodian descent, possibly from a generation that had vanished into the jungle decades earlier during the war. A man who'd escaped or simply run until he was forgotten. As we made camp that night on the outskirts of the valley, I couldn't sleep. The image of those graves wouldn't leave me, nor the sound of that clicking echoing through the trees as we carried the man out. I sat by the fire and tried to piece together what had happened. The best theory, the one we settled on later, was that he'd lived alone for decades, surviving the way animals do, on instinct, on ritual. When the team stumbled into his world, he must have seen them not as intruders, but as something else. Companions, perhaps, or creatures to be kept. Maybe he didn't understand what captivity meant anymore. He'd kept them alive, fed them his food, punished them. When they disobeyed, taught them his sounds. Over time, their bodies failed one by one, and when they died, he buried them carefully, marking their graves with care. Only Evan survived, young, strong, pliable enough to adapt. When we flew back out the next morning, the sun broke over the cliffs, and for the first time the valley looked almost peaceful. You could almost believe it had never held such suffering. The man sat quietly in the chopper, eyes closed, the wind catching in his hair. He didn't struggle, didn't speak. In that moment I felt no anger toward him, just a deep, tired sorrow for all of it. For him, for them, for the way the world can twist solitude into madness. Later in the capital, he was declared mentally unfit for trial and committed to a psychiatric facility. The remains of the four were flown home. Families got their closure, or as close as anyone ever does. Evan remained in the hospital unchanged, still silent, still locked somewhere deep inside himself. Sometimes I wonder if he heard the news, if some part of him recognized that the story had finally found its ending. But when I visited him a few months later, he just sat there by the same window, eyes fixed on the line of trees outside. It struck me then that maybe he hadn't escaped the valley at all. Maybe he just carried it with him, a piece of that silence rooted too deep to ever leave behind. That's how it is with some places. They don't let go, not completely. They stay inside you, patient and still waiting for the day you realize you never really walked out. And as I stood there watching him, listening to the faint clicking in his throat that only he seemed to understand, I felt the same thing I'd felt the moment we stepped into that hidden valley, the sense that somewhere deep in the green, the forest was still listening. When I think about the end of it all, I don't think about the day we flew out of that valley, or the press conference, or the paperwork that followed. I think about the flight home, the dull vibration of the helicopter floor under my boots, the way no one spoke for an hour straight. The man we'd found sat strapped into a seat across from me, head bowed, eyes closed, his hair lifting slightly in the rotor wash. The doctor tried to check his pulse once, but he jerked away with the same small animal motion I'd seen Evan make in the hospital. It struck me then that whatever haunted that place wasn't buried with the others. It had made its way out with both of them, one by blood, the other by memory. When we landed back in Phnom Penh, the air hit like a furnace. The older man, the hermit, as they called him in the reports, didn't fight. He didn't look around or ask questions. He just let himself be led quiet as a shadow into a waiting van that took him straight to the psychiatric wing. I followed long enough to sign the chain of custody papers and hand off my notes. The officer in charge thanked me for my service in the polite, hollow tone people use when they don't yet know what to feel. I remember watching that van pull out into the traffic taillights, disappearing into a blur of motorbikes and dust. And that was it. After 6 years, it was over, at least on paper. Back in Washington, the case wrapped itself in the language of closure. The remains of Luke, Claire, Brian, and Megan were flown home in simple wooden crates, each draped with a flag. Families met them on the tarmac, faces pale and still. I stood off to the side, hat in my hands, not sure if I had the right to be there. Luke's mother found me anyway. She said, "You brought them home. That's enough." I didn't correct her. I didn't tell her I hadn't brought anyone anywhere, that the jungle had simply grown tired of keeping its secrets. The funerals came one after another. Small-town chapels, folded programs, photographs propped beside urns. I went to all of them. Said little, just shook hands, bowed my head, and walked away before the food was served. The Carter family buried Luke beside his father. Claire's brother scattered her ashes along a trail she loved in Idaho. Megan's parents had her memorial plaque placed near a university library. Brian's wife planted a tree behind their house, said it was for their daughter to sit under someday when she wanted to talk to him. Each family made their own piece in their own language, but you could feel the same question pulsing beneath every eulogy. What did they go through in those years? We couldn't find them. No one dared ask it out loud. As for Evan, He stayed in care. The doctors called his condition stable, but that word never sat right with me. He wasn't getting worse, but he wasn't getting better either. I visited him a few times after we got back. He never recognized me. He'd sit by the window like he always had, hands resting on the armrest, eyes fixed on the trees outside. Sometimes he'd make that clicking sound, soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing. The nurses told me it happened most often at dusk, just as the light faded. Once I brought an old photo of the group taken the day they set out. All 5 of them laughing, sweaty sun in their eyes. I placed it on the table beside him, and for a moment his gaze flicked toward it. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came. It wasn't recognition exactly, more like a shadow of it. I left the photo there anyway. The man from the valley lived only a few months after his capture. The psychiatrists said his body simply gave out. Years of malnutrition, infection, isolation. It was a wonder he'd survived as long as he had. They found him one morning still sitting upright, eyes open, as if he'd fallen asleep waiting for someone to come back. There was no name to attach to him, no record of who he'd been before the wilderness claimed him. He was buried in a state lot under a number. I suppose that was fair in its own way. He had spent half a lifetime as a ghost. The investigation closed soon after. Reports were filed, commendations handed out, statements written and rewritten until the story fit neatly on paper. I read the final version once. It said the missing explorers had perished due to prolonged isolation and deprivation under circumstances of involuntary confinement. It sounded tidy, academic, almost clean. But those words didn't capture what I saw in that valley, the quiet care in how those graves were built, the faint traces of order inside that madness. Somewhere in the wreckage of that man's mind, there had still been a thread of decency, twisted though it was. He hadn't killed them out of cruelty. He'd kept them because he couldn't bear to be alone anymore. That truth doesn't bring comfort, but it brings understanding. And sometimes that's all a story like this can offer. I still live in Forks. The same small house, same pine trees leaning toward the window. Some evenings when the rain moves in and the fog settles low, I'll catch the smell of wet moss and be right back there for a moment in that valley, listening to the wind whistle through the trees. People think closure feels like a door shutting, but it doesn't. It's more like a tide going out. The noise fades, the footprints wash away, and you're left standing in the quiet trying to remember where the water used to be. Evan passed away last year. Heart failure, they said. Peaceful in his sleep. He was 42. The nurses told me he'd been calm that evening, sitting by the window as always. One of them said she heard him making that soft clicking sound right before the monitors went still. I don't know if that's true or something she told herself to make sense of it, but I like to believe that somewhere in that sound he found a way home. After his funeral, I drove out to the coast. There's a spot overlooking the Pacific where the land ends in cliffs and the sea starts without asking permission. I scattered a handful of wildflowers there, one for each of them. The air was cold enough to sting my throat, and the ocean below roared like a living thing. I stood there a long while, trying to picture them, not as victims, but as they'd been before all this, alive, joking, chasing something that mattered. Maybe that's what drew them out there in the first place, the belief that some mysteries are worth chasing, even if they never let you come back. I think about that sometimes when people ask why I still tell these stories. They're not easy. You carry every face with you, every unanswered question. But telling them feels like the only way to keep those names from dissolving into the dark. Silence is where these things grow. Light, even the small, imperfect kind we make by talking, keeps them honest. There's a line Luke once said to me before they left, a week before all of this began. He'd been packing up his gear in my garage, making sure everything had its place. I'd asked him what drove him to keep doing these trips, what made him keep walking into the unknown. He smiled that steady smile of his and said, "Because somebody's got to look. If nobody looks, the world just stays asleep." He was right in his own way. They looked. They walked straight into a place that had forgotten the rest of us existed, and for that, they'll never really be gone. Every year I drive out to a small clearing off the logging road, where the memorial plaque stands, 5 names, 4 stones, and 1 small brass compass set in the concrete at the base. When the sun hits it just right, the needle still catches light trembling a little before it settles north. I'll stand there with my hand on it, feeling the cold metal under my palm, and think about how small we are compared to what waits out there just beyond where the maps end. If this story stayed with you, share it not for numbers or noise, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because sometimes remembering is the only kind of justice the world can still give.